Welcome to the Equity Institute's podcast on the purpose of public education with me, your host, Vincent Perez. Today we have Álvarez. They are an educational justice storyteller, catalytic data scientist, leading for structural anti-racist and decolonial change in our learning systems. I had a very fascinating, engaging conversation with Dr. Álvarez. They currently live in Western Washington, where they serve in public K-12 education as an administrator and also an educator. Please welcome Dr. Álvarez.
Well, thank you so much for being with us to explore what public education is and can be. For our audience, could you please introduce yourself?
Hello. And thanks again for having me here. I am Álvarez, and I use they or she pronouns. And as I was just saying, I have been listening to some of the previous episodes and was especially engaged and challenged by Fernell and James's episodes. And I'm just so honored to be here with you today. I am a former educator and a forever student, and I transitioned from higher ed to K-12 a decade ago. And I like to say that in my current role, I'm an educational justice storyteller and catalytic data scientist, agitating from within one of the largest school districts in Western Washington.
I'm curious about that data scientist storytelling. How do you incorporate that in terms of what it means for public education?
Absolutely. Everything is data. Our stories are data, and an N of one is valid. So how do we live and develop as humans? How do we make decisions about how to organize humans, especially as we're growing the next generation and generations? And what are the ways that we value or privilege certain stories versus others? So it's really an interesting marriage of quantitative and qualitative. And I really like to push back at some of those quote unquote best practices when it comes to things like data science.
So I'm curious from that perspective, I really appreciate an N of one is valid. There's something very powerful and meaningful about that. So from this perspective and from your experience in higher ed and K-12, what is the purpose of public education?
I love this question because as many people as there are multiple definitions, right? So I love to use metaphors and visual language, and I'm also a very gesture person. It's hard to be on a Zoom screen when I feel like we need to be in community, in person together. But I like to hold in tension the idea of roots, shoots, and flowers related to the purposes of public education. So I like to contextualize this question by talking about where we've come from, what folks are experiencing right now, and what futurities we can imagine. What are the possibilities we can encourage, embody, and enact and systematize, which isn't as sexy, right? but that's the chair from where I sit. So I want to get beyond this describing and defining and disrupting and dismantling elements of white supremacy in education and moved to dreaming and designing anti-racist spaces for healing and learning. And that's a direct attribution to two scholars who I've worked with previously, Rochelle Rogers-Ard and Christopher Knaus. And they argue that who we are and our racial context is how we lead. And of course, as this relates to public education, there are myriad purposes. So our histories, our system's founding, whose needs were centered in that design, vastly diverge from the neoliberal ways that our systems are presently structured and how learning is delivered and commodified today. And that's totally different from the promises of a liberatory educational model, a public education model. So my aspirational purpose of public education is a practice of freedom is so profoundly different from binary banking models of pedagogy and from hidden curriculums of assimilation and from systems navigation capital. I want public education to be an asset-based agreement about how we develop healthy humans and honor pluralistic knowledges.
The word agreement to me really jumps out. And what you're saying about liberatory and healing spaces to honor our students and all people in the building, right? In this house of learning, and even wondering if it's beyond this box, right? Beyond this physical space, even beyond our virtual space in this nature, right? but actually out in the community. There's a whole exploration there for me about being connected to the world. But I want to come back to this concept of community healing. I put the word community in there because I believe schoolhouses can be space where we really explore our humanity. Recently, I was talking to some young men in their early 20s, my son and my nephew in particular, and I asked them, if school taught you what you really needed to know to live a meaningful, successful, fulfilling life, what would it do? And immediately, one of the first things that came out was how to be with and manage and deal with anxiety. Just this kind of very human piece of me. And I'm curious about what you see in terms of the school offering supports to develop this human side of us, not just what's in our the knowledge or the facts we can spit out.
Absolutely. Absolutely. To me, I immediately draw a connection to Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower. Everything is change. You have anxiety, not you, but the royal you, the second person. We have anxiety about change. That's the only constant. So how do we get to this space where we can encourage growth or change for good, where we interrogate where we are right now, how we got to here, and what is our desired future state? Recognizing that means something's got to give, but nothing happened by accident. These are decisions, and every day we decide not to blow up our system. We're essentially agreeing with the way it's currently configured, implicitly or explicitly. So yes, absolutely. Let's come together. Let's have some anxiety about talking together. But let's use that as anticipation for what could be.
Anticipation for what could be. There's really some power in that.
Yeah. I mean, I think about, I was getting some of that nervous energy that I would, before our chat, that I would get before I would go in front of a classroom or before a community meeting, of just that in your body. What is that feeling that you physically have, and what's going on in your brain, and what are you able to take in and process, and then develop, create while you have all these things going on in your body. And again, we're talking about public ed, mostly K-12. So we're dealing with, tiny humans to less tiny humans, but those are huge stages of development. And when you're talking with your son and your nephew, as young men, you've had an opportunity to see them over this course of time, over this arc of time. Whereas in K-12, you may have a student for a class or a semester or a year, and you don't necessarily get to see the stages and phases. So how do we meet folks where they are with the anxieties they're bringing with them, and be so unapologetically ourselves that it's safe for them to be who they are and who they're becoming?
Thank you. That's very hopeful. Your whole energy is very hopeful. When you talk about, I'm a dreamer, and I love other dreamers to just consider what a future state can be. So you named about the body, and I'm curious, my next question is about what's working, and if it doesn't fit in this realm, certainly answer beyond it. But I've been looking at a bunch of synonyms for social emotional learning, somatic engagement, right? Stress reduction, emotional literacy, nervous system awareness, just simply noticing our body, sensory observation, really thinking about our grounding and in the moments prior to learning, during learning, after learning, intentional breath, embodied discernment. This is just exploring language for me in this area of accessing and noticing and feeling our feelings. I mean, it's that simple to me, because we're taught to stuff it down, ignore it, wait for the bell, trained to comply, and not really honor this very human aspect of who we are. And you mentioned about, I work with Rethink Manhood is another project I have. About 5 years old, Tony Porter writes and speaks about the boys and men being cut off specifically from emotions, right? And so schools are a huge part of that, repression, suppression, right? So I'm curious, what have you seen work in these areas? And then in general, what have you seen really working in education to grow this liberatory learning experience?
Yeah, that's such a rich and engaging and big question. And I firmly believe that one size does not fit all. So what I think is helpful from this planning and administrative space is what are the voices in the chorus that I'm hearing. And sometimes it's a little bit more organized and there's some harmony. Other times it's a little discordant. But the lenses through which we can view the world or view a problem or a challenge to learning are just like trying on a different pair of glasses. So I really lean heavily on four things. I lean heavily on critical race theories and criticality. Race is socially constructed, but racism is materially enacted everywhere and all the time. And some of the writing, specifically as it relates to public education, of course, Derek Bell and Gloria Ladson-Billings. But I also, Delgado and Stefancic, and I also have a couple of props here. I've got Zamudio, Russell, and Rios's, and Bridgman's Critical Race Theory Matters, Education and Ideology. And then also Isabel Wilkerson's Caste, where she argues if race is the skin, caste is the bones. So this idea of disconnecting our bodies from a learning process is not innate. We have to learn how to learn. And that is inherently challenging when you're cut off from language that speaks to you, whether that's rules of math that make sense, whether that's a language other than English, or it's specific vocabulary that's rooted in some academic theories. Some of the other lenses that I use are decoloniality and really just thinking about how imperialism is still very much a practice, and then colonialism is still very much a schooling policy. So again, people who are speaking to this are Linda Tuhiwai-Smith, E. Tuck, Kei-Wei Yang, and Lee Patel. In my own dissertation, I also really used Black feminisms and Chicana feminisms because they talk about the ways that intersectional oppressions are enacted in education. So it's not just that you are Black, it's also that you are a Black woman. And that are two ways of non-normative markedness of difference. And then with Chicana feminisms, it's like, okay, so recognizing you may not be white, you may not be Black, you may not fit into a binary box. So what do you do in that nepentla? What do you do in that in-between space? And is that generative? And how can it be more so? So again, I got like a syllabus here. So this is Audre Lorde, this is Bell Hooks, this is Angela Davis, this is of course Gloria Anzaldúa, Sherry Moraga, and Ana Castillo. And then the last lens comes back to the beginning, this idea of storytelling and counter testimonios. So again, everything is data, and that N of one is valid. You may not be able to speak for everybody, but you've got to speak for yourself, even if it's to yourself. So again, I return to Octavia Butler and the Parable of the Sower. And maybe it'll be easier for folks if I just send you this list of rich wisdom in word form. But that's Austin Channing Brown, Michael Tubbs, Rochelle Brock, Jamila Lyscott, Lee Allen Jones, and Lloyd Newman, Eve Ewing, in particular, Ghost in the Schoolyard, Race and Racism in Closings on the South Side of Chicago. Billy Sankofa Waters, We Can Speak for Ourselves. And then the last one, Rochelle Rogers-Ard and Christopher Knaus again, Black Educational Leadership. So I bring this all back to say, there's so much wisdom out there. There's so much we have learned collectively. So it's about fighting to ignite that learning. One of my favorite quotes from Audre Lorde is that you can literally incite learning like a riot, and finding that moment of creativity, that generation, that spark, and then just getting out of the way. That's what I want public education to be. And that's hard. That's hard to systematize in a classroom, in a school, in a district, in a nation.
What does that actually look like in a day-to-day experience? Could you paint a picture?
Sure.
About, how we go from theory to lived reality? What
are the opportunities to hear and honor the stories that are around us, that we are bringing into a room? Policy discussion about neighborhood schools, and where is the boundary line for this elementary school versus that one? How did we get to there? This idea of bringing criticality with us, and not just as an academic endeavor, but really thinking about system design. Why is it that we have neighborhood schools? In public education, what that's privileging is property rights and whiteness as property and outcomes, not process. So let's rethink what that policy could look like and what that then means for our practices and how we organize our systems. And that's just one example. When I taught, I was in higher ed, so I will steer away from some of the pedagogical theories for K-12, but take it and run with it. There's so many possibilities.
Well, even when you mentioned, I mean, it's a funding structure, right? Real estate and our schools funding, which creates this stratification. There are some school districts in Washington state that I know, I mean, they haven't passed levies for years, and therefore science labs don't have the microscopes. They, like there's just, and you get to another more affluent neighborhood and they have all the learning tools available to them. So I really appreciate this kind of systemic looking at the infrastructure and what policy is there. I'm curious, though, when you invite criticality, especially talking about race and racism with what's happening in our culture wars across the nation, that some say to even talk about race is racist. And part of me doesn't even want to enter in this kind of feeding that kind of question. But when people really are, as Resmaa Menakem writes, to me, there's this charge to this conversation, this 500-year-old charge to race and racism. So when somebody says to talk about race or to acknowledge race is racist, I think there's an inherent denial of history, lived experience, our jails. I mean, there's a whole slew of explanations that can't get answered then. Black students make up 4% of the Washington state population. I get to serve in the state juvenile prison there. Here in Washington state, and they make up 30 to 35% of those who are incarcerated. So how do we pull such a third of those young men who are incarcerated from even 2% because gender, right? We're just pulling boys in this particular facility. Mm-hmm. So I'm curious how you respond to these kinds of backlashes around, in particular, you mentioned critical race theory, right? I have been wondering, and here you are, like, where's the pro-CRT peoples? Where's the saying we need to bring criticality and really apply some solid thinking, right, to the problems that are compounding, and each year and each decade that our young people will have to face in the future. Serious problems. And that to me is why I am even doing this podcast, because without some significant reform, a renaissance really is what I'm calling for in education, serious innovation, they're going to be ill-prepared. So that was a lot I threw at you there, but yeah. I'm curious, how do you address some of these criticisms? And I would say uncritical criticisms, if you will.
Yes, absolutely. I think when there are some folks who cannot see another person's humanity, there's very little room for dialogue. There's very little room for compromise. And when folks are so entrenched, what do? If you can't see me, how are you going to teach me? If you can't see me, how are we going to coexist together to solve these very real shared problems that we're all going to have to face in one way or another? So part of it is being strategic about where and how you show up. And I say you again, but us, how we do that. And I return to this notion of, I want to be the leader that is so unapologetically myself that it's safe for somebody else to be unapologetically themselves.
So what I'm hearing is you're going to bring in, what is the response is to honor one's own dignity, the dignity of others, and bring that in a space where someone cannot recognize you or see your humanity, your basic dignity, not where you're going to strategically spend your effort.
Right. And that's my choice. And maybe there are some folks who want to take up that charge, want to carry that banner. I really love this quote from the Coast Guard Rear Admiral Robert Papp, who was testifying before Congress about the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And one of the things he said was, I consider myself a pragmatist, which I define as an optimist with experience. So that spoke to me in a lot of ways. And that's kind of why I try to bring that hope and that positivity and that generative mindset into these spaces. But it's also real. It's grounded. It's that N of one. That's that life experience that's led us to this point where we recognize that our time is limited. We cannot be everywhere and everything for everyone all the time and still be a balanced, healthy human. So in the spaces that we do show up, let's make that difference. Let's be ourselves. Let's make sure that N of one that we're speaking to is authentic, but also is holding space for other lived experiences, holding space for difference, because that, to me, again, is the greatest illusion, is that of separation. We have much more in common than we do differences.
No, I have been thinking about my grounded theory of emancipatory education begins with dignity and identity. And I think we hold those simultaneously in the dignity aspect of the shared lived experience that we have connections, we have loneliness, we have fear, we have hope, we have love. And then the other side is our differences, right? Our identities. As a Chicano, cis, het, Gen X, urban to suburban, like there's all these aspects of my lived experience that are very different from yours. So, but I think we hold them simultaneously, right? That it's not an either or kind of thinking at all. We actually bring in both. We have our shared humanity and we have our uniqueness. And I'm curious about how you invite or what calls to action you would have to kind of maintain or hold a culture that honors our humanity in these spaces we call schools.
Yes, you said it right there. Moving with empathy and reciprocity. Remember that you are another me and I am another you in Lakesh. Right? It's paramount to see those differences and really to recognize them for what they are, because they do matter, but they matter as much as we assign meaning to them. So it's important to recognize who we are and who we want to be while we're still in the state of becoming. So the other things that may sound a little pithy are things like read, write, ask questions, listen for answers, both within your body and outside of your body, with your ears, your brain, your heart. But you've also got to move your body. You got to stay hydrated. You got to rest. But really, you got to rest. We don't exist to pay bills and lose weight. Okay? Be curious, stay humble, and we're only limited by our imaginations.
Thank you. I've been closing these interviews up with the big question about your schooling experience. And did you go to public ed? And two, what was its impact on you? And in particular about your spirit, right? Your well-being, your self-image, how did it impact you? And obviously with a doctorate, you've pursued this pathway of education in formal schooling. So I'm curious, what was it K-12 like for you?
Yeah, absolutely. As a student, change felt constant to me. I moved around a lot as a kid. So it was like an average of changing schools every 2 years. And one of my first memories of public schooling is actually in I guess it was a kindergarten classroom in Northern California. It was for Spanish speaking students. And I was drawing a picture of an elephant because I didn't understand what was going on. And I have a distinct memory of creative expression in a system that didn't see me. That's the poetic way to put it. But I also remember having lunch with the school principal who taught me how to spell my last name. And those are interesting contrasts of experiences to have as a very young student, looking for an outlet and trying to learn who I am. And then, I remember other educators throughout my experience who treated me with compassion, who recognized my humanity. I had a bladder accident in elementary school, as many students do, because we're just learning about our bodies. And there was a miscommunication, and it was my states and capitals test, and I thought I was going to be done on time, and I wasn't. And it happens. But the way the teacher held me and held space for me and tried to make a situation a little bit more tolerable, a little bit more bearable, that's the stuff that I remember. In middle school, I had a teacher who, after I had left her class, wrote me a letter, like an old school, like snail mail, words of encouragement. You got this. I see you. You may be going through some stuff right now, but you have something in you. And in high school, I had a really negative experience. I almost dropped out. After 10th grade, I failed in all but one class. And I had some serious familial challenges and changes going on in addition to my own mixed race and queer identities. And I was not expected to graduate, let alone go on to higher ed or work in education, despite several family members either being educators or former educators or some other form of public servant. One of the most revolutionary lessons I had in undergrad was when an educator said to me, I don't know. I want to have an informed opinion about this. So I can't speak to this right now, but I'm going to do some research and come back to you. That was powerful, and that stuck with me today. And then I just recently finished my doctoral program. And in addition to the beautiful lessons that the cohort of agitators shared with me, I learned how to tell my own stories and to own them and to honor the wisdom of my body. And my hope is that we move away from schooling to learning, to healing, to growing so that others can learn how to tell their stories.
Thank you. My position is that public ed can, at its best, foster stable human beings. I mean, it's that simple, it's that short. So what does it mean to be a stable human being, right? What knowledge, skills, and attributes do we need to acquire, to practice, to explore, to unearth even from within, right? Because that's where's all the wisdom that we inherently have and have inherited ourselves from our own families, funds of knowledge. And this conversation really is affirming for me in trying to pursue this form of like this result of education, right?
Yeah, you're talking about outcome and process right now. One of the interesting things you just brought up for me was you said, how do we be stable humans? But when we started this podcast, we were talking about change. And change is inherently disruptive to stability. So if we are trying to grow stable humans, what does stability mean? Does that mean you have a way to navigate through the change? That's what I hope for. And you do that with empathy, with compassion, with reciprocity, with self-advocacy, but also being your sibling's keeper.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I appreciate that tie-in, that stability so that we can adapt to change, right? But otherwise, isn't it just overwhelming, and how do we respond to change and adapt if we don't really kind of ground and root in all the things that allow us to respond in good ways?
Absolutely. And that's what's so interesting too about AI and mathematical rules or language rules. Once you learn the rules, then you can learn how to break the rules. So yeah, let's figure out how we can break this stability so we can get the change that we need.
Well, thank you for your time. It's a very stimulating conversation and very hopeful. I think folks like you in public ed, and I mean you directly, is just very nourishing for my own vocation, right? For my own calling here, just to have other people in the field who are working to honor the humanity of our young people and all the adults in the system.
Absolutely. Public education is absolutely an endeavor of hope. It's an investment in hope of our future right now, today.
All right. That's going to put a pin on that one. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate your time. Thank you for a gift. Thank you.
It was so lovely to chat with you. Thank you again for the opportunity and take care, man.